If you've got young children, you should name guardians. The issue we have is that if you pass away, let's say husband and wife go out for an evening out and they don't come home, then they've not written a will who's named guardians. State will ultimately decide where those children go. So what they do is they'll take those children, potentially put them into care, all because of the fact you didn't spend 250 quid writing a will and naming a guardian. My mum was disinherited. So disinherited is ultimately where, assets go to somebody else other than the family. My nana and my granddad worked their entire lives and none of their own family benefited from anything they ever did. Nothing, not even a ring, nothing. There is a chance that one set of children potentially could be disinherited. It doesn't have to be that way. Most people, when they buy a house with somebody else, they'll own it jointly. So I can't put a jointly owned asset into a will. 42,000 homes are sold every single year to pay for care. And because they then own that house 100%, it's then attackable. The local authority just bulldozing in and selling that property from underneath us. And nothing, repeat, nothing will eat your wealth quicker than generational inheritance tax.
Mike, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. There's a few reasons I felt it was really important to have you on this show. First and foremost, I've known you for a few years. You handle all of our asset protection, estate planning, for which I'm really grateful. I've asked you loads of questions and you've taught me a lot. That's been of immense value. But also, what I found is through our coaching academy, Ignite Academy, we have different groups called cohorts of 12 people that we meet with monthly to help them grow their businesses and grow their wealth and assets. Mm-hmm. We also do one-on-one coaching. And what's really struck me is whilst we help them achieve more, gain more wealth, increase their asset portfolio, they don't really know how to protect it. And not only that, but just generally being out in social conversations, so many people oversee this and they don't understand the importance of it, but more so, they don't understand the ramifications of not paying attention to this. And that's why I felt it's so important to have this conversation. I think a really good way to start, having heard the story about what happened within your family and why this is so important.
Okay, yeah. So my story is that, my mum ultimately, the story is all about my mum. My mum was disinherited. So disinherited is ultimately where, assets go to somebody else other than the family, as it were. So my nana and my granddad, worked his entire life. He died fairly early on in life. So he was only 53 when he died. So he was the same age as me when he actually passed away. But what they had, like most people tend to have, is just a simple basic will. So that basic simple will says, I've got the assets today. And when I die, I'm going to pass those assets to you. So what happened was when my granddad passed away, all the assets flowed to my nana. So my nana was only, 52 or whatever she was at the point that my granddad passed away. So she had all the assets, she had the house, some cash and bits and pieces. But what happened at that point then was that my nana then met Bill. So she remarried at that point. So she took all the assets with her that my granddad had worked so hard for into that new marriage. She'd paid down some of Bill's mortgage and they'd lived in his house there for the rest of their days. But the issue for my mum was, because my mum was an only child as well, but the issue for my mum is that my nana died first. And when she died, again, they'd set up a simple basic will each. So what happened then was that everything then passed to Bill. But the problem for my mum, again, was that Bill had his own daughter. So what Bill then did is he changed the will at that point and left everything to his daughter. So she just had a house clearance. And literally they came in, sold the house, sold all the contents of the house all in one go, as it were, which then meant that my nana and my granddad worked their entire lives and none of their own family benefited from anything they ever did. Nothing, not even a ring, nothing. And that story it resonates with a lot of people because we get, again, here in the UK, especially now in this day and age that we are now, there's a lot of blended families. There's a lot of people that get married and then get divorced. I'm second married now. So, I've got my 2 children from my first marriage and my wife's got her 2 children from her first marriage. But if I didn't have a proper will with a trust structure within it, and I just had a simple basic will, then history could potentially be repeating itself for me. So in other words, if I died and I left everything to my wife, although I trust my wife implicitly, there's nothing stopping her at that point from going, I never got on very well with these kids, so to hell with them. It's all going to go down my line. So again, in that situation, history would just be repeating itself with me. So we need to make sure that when we talk about estate planning, we talk about, having a trust structure within your wills, as it were, to make sure that what you're creating in your lifetime is fully protected and preserved for the people that you ultimately want to benefit. And you're not losing assets through the divorces and the creditor claims and the care fees and the bankruptcies and the generational inheritance tax, which is a massive one. So important. But people, like you say, people don't really understand it. Most people think, well, I've got my will and I'm completely sorted. But the trouble is, it's always better to have a will than not have a will. But it's just not going to do ultimately what you're expecting it to do, i.e. protect any of the assets. It's just going to pass those assets on to those named beneficiaries that you've named within that will.
That's a fucked up story.
It is. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. It really, really is hard. But it's so easy to stop. And that's the thing. But people just don't realize, it, because again, like I say, most people think when they talk about estate planning, they're talking about a will. And yes, you are talking about a will, but it's having all the other bits and pieces that go with that will that ultimately protects those assets.
Yeah.
But most people struggle 70% of the UK population haven't even got a will. So, there's only 30% that actually do have a will. And most of them, probably 95% of those people will just have a simple basic will. Yeah. Because that's what they believe that they need to have.
Mike, you'll have to forgive me because I know that through the years that we've known one another, I'm always asking you questions and you've educated me on wills and trusts and estate planning. This conversation, I'm going to be asking you questions that I already know the answers to, only because there will be people listening to this who won't have a clue. So please forgive me for some of the basic questions I might ask you.
There's never a basic question.
Yeah. I think a really good question to start with is, what is a will and what is a trust?
So a will is just a legal document that outlines what your wishes are with regard to where you want your assets ultimately to go at the point that you pass away. So when you pass away, you go through something that they call probate. So when you go through probate is really just realizing the assets that you've got, valuing those assets that you've got, and then, paying any taxes that you've got outstanding, any inheritance tax or any loans or, debts that you've got outstanding. Once all that's been completed and paid, you then get what they call grant of probate. And once you've got the grant of probate, that's when you can distribute the assets. So normally, if you've just got a simple basic will, which will name, my children my wife as the first line beneficiary, the children as the second line beneficiary, all that will happen then is those assets would then just be transferred directly into the estates of those individuals. So, and that's the problem, is that those assets are then distributed directly into the estates. They belong to those new beneficiaries, as it were.
Why is that a problem?
It's a problem because of the fact, inheritance tax, as we know, is a massive issue here in the UK. So say, for instance, I passed away, and I've got a sizable estate when I pass away, and I pay some inheritance tax. Let's say I pay inheritance tax on the estate after I've passed away. Now, I paid it once then at that point. If I then just pass those assets directly on to my children, for instance, let's say I give them £1 million each, I've immediately created them an inheritance tax liability purely just on the value that I've given them as an inheritance. So that's regardless of what they may well create in their own lifetimes. So when they then pass away, now they're going to pay inheritance tax now for a second time on the assets they've already paid inheritance tax on. Now for me, that's absolutely crazy, because that's what we call now generational inheritance tax. And nothing, repeat, nothing will eat your wealth quicker than generational inheritance tax. Whereas if I have my estate, when I die, go into trust at the point that I pass, so once I've got that grant of probate, have the assets assigned into trust, those assets then could still be loaned to my beneficiaries, but because they're loaned to my beneficiaries, they never form part of my beneficiaries' estates. So they still have all the benefit. They can do whatever they want to do with those assets, spend it, give it away, take it to the casino, do whatever they want to do with those assets. The difference is that they don't belong to my children. And because they don't belong to my children, they don't form part of my children's estates. So, but also it protects it then from my children's divorces, creditor claims, care fees, and all the other bits and pieces, because they don't own the assets. The trusts own the assets. Those assets have only ever been loaned to them for the rest of their lives. But at the point that they then pass, what we're then saying is that because it was a loan, it's classed as a debt to their estate. So when they then pass away, we want the value to come back to the trust. Now, what that does for my children is it ultimately reduces down their inheritance tax liability, because of the fact there's a debt that's owed back to my trust for the value that I lent them as an inheritance. Whereas if I'd given them those assets, I'd have increased the size of their estates and they'd be paying inheritance tax now for a second or third time on the assets that I gave them as an inheritance.
So we know what a will is.
We know what a will is.
Now, what's a trust?
A trust is a legal entity, really just a piece of paper. But it's its own separate legal entity. And all you're doing is assigning your assets at the point that you pass to that legal asset, to that legal entity, which is called the trust. And then all you're doing from that is you're just loaning assets out to beneficiaries. Right. That's the idea of it. But the ownership stays with the trust.
Right.
So when you have a trust, you have what they call trustees. And it's the trustee's job to manage the assets for the benefit of those beneficiaries. Mm-hmm. Now, the trustees could be the same as the beneficiaries. You could be a trustee and a beneficiary, which is normally what would happen with the normal estate planning when you do a normal will, is that you would name, I'd name my children as the trustees, I'd name my children as the beneficiaries, so they can manage the assets and they can also benefit from the assets.
With the trust, you say that it has trustees and it has beneficiaries, okay? The beneficiaries are the ones that take benefit from the trust, and the trustees are the ones that carry out what part?
They manage the assets ultimately.
Okay.
So it's their job to manage the assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries. So that's that's distribution. That's, if you're looking to invest some funds, as it were, through the trust, as it were, then those trustees ultimately would be there to manage those assets, and also to do things like, administration work on the 10th anniversary. Because when you have a trust and that trust is activated, we need to obviously report that back to HMRC every 10 years, because there may well be a periodic charge. Right. With a trust, which is a 6% charge on any value over the 325,000 nil rate band amount, which everybody has.
So the 325,000 is what the beneficiaries can take or receive?
No, they can take the whole lot. So if I put £1 million into the trust, as it were, they can take that £1 million and do whatever they want to do with it. They're going to get their inheritance in the normal way. The difference is with a trust is that if you put more than 325,000 into a trust, it triggers what they call a periodic charge. So in 10 years' time, because it's paid every 10 years, there's a sweep across the trust to find out, well, what's the value of the trust now today? And if the value is deemed to be over the 325, then there would be a 6% charge on that value over 325,000.
Okay. So by having a trust, the beneficiaries are not paying any inheritance tax at all?
No, they're going to pay inheritance tax on what they create themselves, not on what I left them as an inheritance.
Explain that to me, please.
So again, it's no different really to thinking if I loaned you £1,000, you know that £1,000 isn't yours.
Yeah.
You know it still belongs to me.
Yeah.
So, and that's really all a trust is doing. It's saying, well, I've got the assets, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to loan those assets out. And because I've loaned that asset to you, it doesn't form part of your estate.
Right.
And because it doesn't form part of your estate, well, then it can't be attacked for inheritance tax because you don't own it.
Yeah.
The trust owns it.
Yeah.
But because I loaned it to you, it becomes a debt to your estate.
Yes.
So when you pass, I'd quite like that back.
Yeah.
So what we're saying is from your estate, I don't want the actual, the different assets back. I just want the value.
Right.
So if there was a house that went in there and a car and some cash and bits and pieces and it amounted to, I don't know, let's say 700,000 and you took it all out to go and do what you wanted to do with it. What I'm saying is at the point that you pass from your estate, I'd quite like 700 grand back.
Right.
Because the other beautiful thing with that is that my grandchildren can come forward, take that same 700,000 and go do the same thing over their lifetime.
Right.
And so on. So what I'm actually doing at that point is I'm creating legacy. I'm not just saying, well, I've died, here you go, spend it wisely. Because the major issue with that, not only is the inheritance tax, but it's the divorces. If I just left my son today £1 million for argument's sake, and he then goes and gets married and gets divorced, well, I know as a minimum I'm going to lose 50% of that now, drifted off down the road to feather a nest of people that I've never ever met. That's not what I'm working my socks off for. I'm working my socks off for my family and my grandchildren and their children and their children and so on. So for me, the driver for me with all of it is about creating legacy. My children benefit, my grandchildren benefit, their children benefit. It stays within the bloodline. I don't want assets drifting off down the road. That's not what it's about. Whereas if I just had a basic will, there's a very strong possibility because we know statistically 42% of all marriages are going to end in divorce. So if I'm giving that money to my son and he goes through that divorce, I know that ultimately some of the wealth that I created is going to go drifting off down the road. And that's not what estate planning is about,
Right.
in my opinion.
So I'm gonna let you know how I've interpreted that, and you just tell me if I'm correct. Where a person is left, let's say £1 million in a will, okay? Not only do they have an inheritance tax, let's say that person now gets married, okay? And then unfortunately he gets divorced, okay?
Yeah.
Half of whatever's left after the inheritance tax, okay?
Yeah.
Or whatever he has goes to his spouse, okay? In a standard divorce situation. Now she gets married, okay?
Yeah.
She's now got a new husband.
Yeah.
Okay. And let's say in a hypothetical situation, she was to pass away. That new person, that new husband number 2, is now getting his claws into that money, and it's going down to his bloodline, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. It's left the bloodline at that point.
Yeah. That's fucked up. Okay. Now with a trust basically protects that from happening because the beneficiaries do not own the assets.
You've got it.
They just benefit from it.
You've got it.
As and when they need to. Okay.
You've got it.
That's great. Okay.
You've got it.
Tell me about a typical setup, a typical situation with a standard family, a standard couple, a standard client that you might work with.
First thing is obviously to understand, what their driver is, as it were, so what are they looking to achieve? Because when you talk about estate planning, there's 2 defined elements of estate planning. There's the death planning, which is all about, well, what happens to the assets at the point you pass? Where are they going? How are they going? And then you've got what they call lifetime planning. So lifetime planning is about, well, what am I doing today to start protecting some of this stuff, to start mitigating some of this inheritance tax and such like? That comes under the lifetime banner. So when we talk to clients firstly about the death planning, because the death planning is the bit that we always do first. It's always done first. And the reason we do that first is because it's all very well trying to mitigate a bit of inheritance tax over here, but if you haven't got the death planning sorted out, all this becomes useless. So we start off with the death planning, and also because we don't know when that's going to happen, dare I say it.
So is that the will part?
That's the will part. The death planning is the will part. Yeah. So we're going to talk to the clients. We're going to find out who they're, the kind of the assets that they've got, the value of those assets they've got, to determine whether or not they've got an inheritance tax liability or not, because that has a factor on the planning that we would then recommend. We're looking at who the beneficiaries are, who those trustees are going to be. If the children are minors, do we need to add guardians? And if so, who are those guardians going to be? And then it's really just a question of trying to put all that together. But you've got to remember with the death planning, because nothing goes into those trusts until you pass away, really all we're doing is creating a will with a trust structure within that will sufficient to hold whatever the value of the estate is at the point that you pass. Because it's only at the point that you pass and the value and you go through that probate process and you get the grant of probate, would any assets then start to go into the trusts. So it's just really an empty shell at the moment that we're creating, that we're then really storing away.
Right. And that's the difference between having a standard will, which most people have. People who have wills just have standard wills that aren't.
Yes, a standard will is, again, you same thing. So you're still going to have your, who your executors are going to be, who your guardians are going to be, who your beneficiaries are going to be. The difference is that really it's just saying, well, look, when I die, those assets will ultimately be passed directly to you. And that's really is the issue. It's about how assets are passed and who then becomes the owner of those assets. That's the real issue that we have, dare I say it, here in the UK, because assets are passed directly into the estates of beneficiaries.
I'm thinking of like a common situation that you come across frequently, whereby they haven't got their affairs in order, and what the ramifications would look like.
Most people will come to us saying, I want to protect my assets because I am worried that, I'm going to lose half of it down the road. That's most people are worried about the fact that, when they've gone, the children are going to get divorced. It may well be a bit of the generational inheritance tax. It's that sort of stuff, really. So again, it would be a husband and wife, 2 children, as it were. It's about making sure that the wills are in place. We've got the trust structure in place inside the wills. We've got some lasting power of attorney. That's another big one. We'll have a chat about that. But it's really the will, the trust structure within the will, to ensure that when they do pass, those assets go into trust,
right,
for the benefit of those children and nobody else.
Tell me about how, because you touched on guardians, like having guardians for the children, and you touched on lasting power of attorney. Tell me a bit more about those 2 aspects.
Well, guardians is really important. If you do a will for no other reason, you should always do a will, a basic, simple will, if it has to be, just to name guardians. If you've got young children you should name guardians. The issue we have is if you pass away, let's say husband and wife go out for an evening out and they don't come home and they've left, two little children, as it were, that are minor children behind, and they've not written a will who's named guardians. Well, the issue then potentially is that those children, although they may have two loving families that will say, yeah, we'll have them, state will ultimately decide where those children go. So what they do is they'll take those children, potentially put them into care for a period of time while they interview the families. Because although you're saying, well, actually, we'll take them, it's like, well, how do we know that they're going to be, you're the right person for them to go to? Because that was never written within a will. It's not named that. So what we'll do is we'll take them away, we'll interview the families, and we will decide in our own time, probably 6-12 months, where those families or where those children are going to be placed.
I need to ask you a question on that. Adam has passed away.
Mm-hmm.
His wife has passed away, Samantha. Adam and Samantha, okay? They have 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
What you've just said to me is Adam's brother can't come along and just say, hey, look, that's my niece and nephew, I'll look after them.
Well, they may well do to start with, but ultimately it would be down to the decision of the state. And the state would decide as to where they're best going to be placed. Social services and all that sort of stuff would be involved in it, all of it.
So initially those kids could go into
They
care
potentially
system.
could do, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that
All because of the fact you didn't spend 250 quid writing a will and naming a guardian. I mean, a lot of people will say to us, I haven't really done it at the moment because we can't decide who we want as a guardian. It's just like, it makes no difference. Just put anybody down, put any family member down. It makes no difference. At least you've named somebody. But if you don't do it and something happens, well, then you're going to be in a world of pain.
Yeah, that's a serious...
But that's, not only have the children just lost their parents now we're in a situation where they potentially could even be in a care home.
Well, now they're living with strangers. That's when they need to be around their family most, their uncles and aunties or whoever it might be.
Most people think that it's just one of those things that, you do when you're much, much older sort of thing. But really, you should have a will. If you're 18, you should have a will. It doesn't need to have all the bells and whistles. It just needs to be a basic, simple will that names, your mum and dad, your brother, whoever it is, because you're probably going to have a car, maybe. You might have a job, so you might have a bank account and such like with a bit of money in it, as it were. So you need to have a will just to ultimately pass those assets to whomever you want them to go to. But a will is one of those documents that should evolve over your lifetime as well. It's not just a kind of, well, I do it when I get to the age of 60, for argument's sake, which is what most people tend to think. But it's also the one thing that always gets put off. I know I should do a will, but I'll do it another time. I'll do it another time. I met a lady, it was a good few years ago now. I met a lady, I was down in Southampton at the time. And I said to the lady, have you got your wills and stuff sorted out? And she was like, no, I don't have to worry about that at the moment because I'm still, whatever age she was. I was just like, how can you say that though? Because I've got to go home tonight along the M4. I can't guarantee that I'm going to get home tonight. So you tell me how you can guarantee that you don't need a will at this point. And she was like, I kind of understand that now a little bit, because it's that preconceived idea that people think you need to be of an age before you start getting a will, thinking about having a will. But it's such an important document. To be fair, it's the most important document you're ever going to write, because it deals with what you've created over your lifetime and passes it on to the people that you want to benefit from it.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important. But now I'm thinking about those kids, let's say their parents have passed away, just understanding how fragile they will be, and they need to be around the people that love them and care for them the most. It's not going to be their parents because they're not here anymore, but it will be the extended family.
Yeah.
And now they're with strangers. Not that those strangers won't care, but they're alien.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately they will end up going to some family members later on, but there's that gap, isn't there? There's that bit in the middle that is not, that's heartbreaking for me. I would, just even to think of that, to think, oh Christ, if I died, my kids would go, you immediately go out, even if you just went to W.H. Smith's and got yourself a DIY will for 20 quid, you just go and do it and write them down and sign it and witness it and be done.
Yeah. I want to understand, can the guardians, can they get their hands on the estate? Do they benefit from the estate financially in any way? How does that work?
Yeah, so again, that depends on what you've said within your wills, as it were, and who those beneficiaries potentially are. But ultimately, you would want to, if you pass away, if you've named guardians, you would want to be leaving some assets to the, for the benefit of the guardians. But also, because you're leaving assets ultimately to the children, that especially if you're doing it through a trust, the trustees are not then going to say, well, actually, no, you can't have anything. Because when you have a trustee, you can name and stipulate the age that the children need to be or can be when they inherit. So for mine, for instance, all of my planning, my children won't inherit anything until they're 25.
Right.
But if I died while my children were still minors, the trustees have the ability to use funds, as it were, and the guardians can come to the trustees for funds, as it were, for the benefit of the kids. Right. But it's always got to be for the benefit of the kids. They can't just take funds out just because they want to do whatever they want to do. It's always for the benefit of the children. Right. And as long as that's documented, then that's fine.
And that's what the trustees handle, making
that's
sure
what the trustees have to handle. Yeah, absolutely.
So they can't just take it out for a jolly up or to invest in their own interests or anything like that.
No.
Okay. So Mike, who do you find that people typically set up as the guardian? What is the pattern that you're observing there?
It's normally a family member. So it's normally, ideally, it needs to be somebody of equivalent age to what you are. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a lot of people will say, well, I can't decide, so I'm going to put my mum, mm-hmm. which is fine for a period of time. But the issue then is obviously when it happens to mum and the children are still minors, we're going to be left without a guardian. So you need to have, at least the mum, and then you need to really have a reserve, of somebody of equivalent age, as it were. So, it may well be, your brother, your sister, it may even be one of the older children.
Right.
So if you've got an older child that's maybe 19, 20, and then you've got a younger one who's still kind of 13, 14, well, then that older child potentially could be named as a guardian.
Should I have a backup, like a backup guardian, even if the guardian that I've chosen, the primary guardian, is of similar age to me?
Yes. It's always best to future-proof because you just don't know what's going to happen. If you just name one person, it's no different with the lasting power of attorney. If you just named one attorney and that one attorney passes away, well, now you're left with nobody.
Right, okay.
So the whole thing fails at that point. So you need to be making sure that you've got somebody and then a reserve that potentially could step up to the plate if anything happens to this person.
Yeah, okay. And in terms of the trustees, mm-hmm. what happens if the trustees pass on?
Again, same thing. You would name reserve trustees again. So you'd name this person is the trustee, and then these people are, the reserve trustees. So with most of the stuff that we would do, we would probably name your children as reserve trustees.
Right.
So if they're not of an age at the moment, we would name them as reserve trustees. It may well be that you decide that you want to have a professional trustee, and that's a very good thing to have, because the thing with the trustee role is, and with trust, is that not many people know how they work. So I've got professional trustees on my planning, as it were. So although I understand it, my children won't have a clue, not a clue how the whole thing works. And I've set the planning up for a specific reason. So in other words, I want it to be preserved. But if my children don't understand what the trust is all about, all they're going to do is come to the trust and take it all out and off they go. They're not going to know anything about the loan notes and such like. So I've got professional trustees on there that are there purely to give advice at the time. That's all they do. So they're not there to get involved with who said this and what and all the rest of it. They're there purely just to give advice as to how the whole thing works, and also then to do the whole kind of 10-year bit as well, help with all that info, all that administration of it, as it were.
And that's typically a company, the professional trustee?
Typically a company that we would do, yeah. So we've just set up, as of this month, our own corporate trustee. So we can act now as trustees on all of our planning that we do for our clients.
So let's say, for example, if I set up a professional trustee on my trust, mm-hmm. and I'm no longer here, mm-hmm. and that company dissolves or goes into administration.
It's exactly the same as if somebody died. So your reserve trustees would sit up at that point. So as long as you've got, reserve trustees in place, because you always need to have a minimum of 2 trustees on any trust for accountability more than anything else. So normally we would set it up where, it would be you and a professional trustee, and then you would have, your children then as reserve trustees. So if anything happened to the professional trustee company or your children would just come forward to become full trustees at that point.
And can they then change the trustees?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So they would just naturally add on, so we'd add additional reserve trustees later on.
Right. Yeah. So each generation can keep on making those changes.
And that's the beauty of it. And that's why it goes there, because they'll also need to name beneficiaries. Mm-hmm. So their children, for instance, people that I don't know at the moment, because, my planning at the moment goes, well, my wife is the first line beneficiary. Mm-hmm. So a second line beneficiary would be my children. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it goes on to my grandchildren. But I haven't got any grandchildren at the moment. So when my children become trustees and beneficiaries at that point, they would need to name their own children as the next line of succession mm-hmm. to that trust.
What are the common things that you find people stipulate within their wills and trusts, like the conditions that they have within their wills and trusts?
Conditions? Not really conditions. It's more about just how the assets pass.
Like, for example, people might have some unusual assets, or they might have a collection of watches or jewelry. How do you find that people normally handle?
Yeah, well, that sort of thing really is, again, all that sort of stuff. So the watches, the jewelry, the paintings and all that sort of stuff, we would normally do as a memorandum of wishes.
Okay.
So within the memorandum of wishes, so I don't know if you know this, but if I had a Rolex watch and I put it in my will that I've got a Rolex watch and I'm leaving that Rolex watch to my son. Now, because I've put that asset into a legal document saying to my son, you are going to receive this Rolex watch when I die, and I go on holiday and lose that Rolex watch, but I never replace it. The problem now is I've got a legal document that says my son's going to receive a Rolex watch. So unless he's really kind and thinks, well, Dad lost it, I don't really need it. Unless he's like that, or if he decides actually, no, I want it, well, then the estate at that point is going to go out and buy him one.
Oh.
So we would always do that as a memorandum of wishes. So the memorandum of wishes is the non-legally binding bit that sits alongside the trust as to who the beneficiaries are of these particular assets. And then we would just name those assets and we would name who those beneficiaries are.
Right.
Quite straightforward. Yeah. But 9 times out of 10, when it comes to those sort of things, it's, the kids just come into the house, they take what they need to take, and
right. Okay.
It's simple with that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Lasting power of attorney. Tell me about lasting power of attorney.
Well, lasting power of attorney, dare I say it, is more important to you personally. More important to you personally than all the planning that leaves everything to everybody else. The reason I say that is because today you have all the assets, you can do what you want to do with your assets, no problems at all. But if you lost capacity at this point, which is what the power of attorney is about, if you lost capacity at the moment, you need to be naming attorneys that can ultimately make decisions for you. So, like I say, with the planning that leaves everything to everybody else, that all comes into effect at the point that I die. Now, I haven't died at this point. The problem I've got now is that if somebody's using my power of attorney, I am probably not in great shape. And I want to make sure that it's my wife and my children, my loved ones, people that I know, love and trust, that are making the decisions about actually what happens to me, about my finances, about the house, about the hospital treatment I'm receiving and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I can only have that if I've written a lasting power of attorney. So with a power of attorney, there are 2. You have one for property and finance and one for health and welfare. And you're naming attorneys for all of those, for those 2 powers of attorney, as it were. So at the point that I lose capacity, they can step up and ultimately become me and make the decisions in my best interest. And that's also really important. It's always got to be about what's in my best interest. So what they can't do with a power of attorney is they can't come and now change my will, for instance. Right. So this is something that we get a lot of, where, we get a lot of people that will say, oh, look, my mum's, 80, she's, got dementia, she's about to go into a care home. What can I do? Because she, Dad passed away 7 years ago. She owns the house 100% at this point, and it's potentially going to be used to pay for care. It's just like, well, you can't use your power of attorney to start messing around with the will and starting to put assets into trust. That's an abuse of power at that point.
Mm-hmm.
You've always got to look at, with a power of attorney as, well, what's in the best interest of the client.
So just going back on that situation that you just described there, selling the house and using the capital from the house sale for care, how does someone avoid that?
Well, the thing to remember with care fees is that if you've got assets over £23,250, you're going to pay the bill. It's as simple as that. But what you can do is you can shelter assets from being used potentially to pay for care. So when we talk to clients, most people, if you own a property with somebody else, your main residence, it's normally the main asset that most people tend to have. Now, the problem is in the UK is that most people, when they buy a house with somebody else, they'll own it jointly. Now, the problem with jointly owned means that we both own it 100%. So, for instance, I can't put a jointly owned asset into a will. And the reason I can't do that is because I don't know which one of us is going to pass first.
Mm-hmm.
So what we would always advise is that we split the house in half. So instead of owning it jointly, we want it to be owned what they call tenants in common. Tenants in common means I own 50% of it, you own 50% of it. Now, if I died, my 50% at that point, via my will go into my trust. It'll be earmarked to go into my trust. So if we owned a house together, you would be named as the first line beneficiary and a trustee of the trust that owns my half, but you would also physically own your own half. Now, if you went into care now, at this point, after I'd passed away, well, now they couldn't come after you and make you forcefully sell the property because you only own half a house. The trust owns the other half of the house. So yes, they may well come and put a charge on your half, but half is all they would get. They couldn't attack my half because you don't own my half. And it's the same also if we were still alive. They still couldn't come after my half because you don't own my half. They can only attack assets that you own. So that's one way, and that's the most common way. The other way you can do it potentially is you can convey the ownership of your property to trust. So we have what they call a PPPT trust, Probate Preservation Plus Trust, where you can convey the ownership of your house into trust. So I did it for my mum. We lost my dad nearly 8 years ago now. And my mum, when my dad died, they had the tenants in common. So when dad died, mum decided to sell the house because it was too big for her on her own, and she moved down closer to where I am. So when she sold the house physically at that point, half of that cash that was in the equity that was in that property went into dad's trust. And mum had her own half, which was hers to go and do with whatever she wanted to do. So what mum did at that point was she came down, she bought a house, where I am. She used her cash and she borrowed some cash from dad's trust to be able to buy the house outright. Now, I didn't want to go on the title because if I go on the title for mum's property, because she now owns that property solely, which is a real issue because if she goes into care, obviously, she owns 100% of that property. So one option would be that I went on to the title. The issue I have with that is that I've already got an inheritance tax liability. So if I do that, half of the value of mum's house is now going to form part of my estate. Didn't want that. But also because it's not my main residence, if mum then passed away and I then went and sold that property, I'm going to be hit with a capital gains liability because it's not my main residence. So I didn't want that either. So the only option I had was to put it into trust. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you put it into trust as a way of ultimately mitigating having to pay for the care. Now, there's one thing I need to make clear with this is that if my mum goes into care, there is absolutely no question that she will have the best care possible. She's my mum at the end of the day. She brought me into the world. She's done everything for me. So at the time that she needs us, she will have the best care. Now, the reason I put the property into trust was that so myself and my brother as the trustees would be in control of the property. I didn't want the local authority just bulldozing in and selling that property from underneath us, as it were, and taking the cash to pay for mum's care. I would sell that property within the trust, and as a trustee, I would make the payments to pay for mum's care. Absolutely no question. So I would still use the property. The difference is that I'm in control. And that's really what it's all about. It's about being in control of the assets.
So you just mentioned that the local authority could come in and literally take the house and sell it. That's what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. If mum went into a care home and she didn't have the physical cash to pay for that care on a monthly basis, somebody's going to come round and do an assessment on mum's estate as to what assets have you got, what value is this? And the house is an absolute classic. 42,000 homes are sold every single year to pay for care. And 9 times out of 10, that happens because the house was owned jointly, the husband or the wife passed away, and later on the survivor actually went into care. And because they then own that house 100%, it's then attackable. It can be sold at that point because they own it 100%. What we're saying with our structure is if we do severance of tenancy, yes, they may well come after half, but that's really all they can come after.
Do you have to own the house outright to put it in trust, or can you have a mortgage on it?
Yeah, you can have a mortgage on it, yeah. You can, because you're putting the equity share into the trust ultimately. Yeah. The difference is that if you've got a mortgage on it, it's always easy to do it without a mortgage, but if you do it with a mortgage on, you're going to be stuck with that mortgage provider. So you can't then remortgage on, as it were, because the property is owned by the trust, not by yourselves. So ideally, it should be, mortgage free, but you can do it with a.
Okay, so let's stick with that for a moment. Let's say a person's got a house, they got a mortgage, they got a mortgage provider. How do they change their mortgage provider? Let's say at the end of
they don't. So they'll need to stay with that mortgage provider that they're with at the time they transfer it into the trust.
Is it just an administrative thing where if they did change mortgage provider, they can just update things administratively?
No. Well, most lenders will look at the land registry and see that the property is actually in the name of the trustees. So in a trust, and they lenders don't like trusts.
So let's say, for example, I've got a property in my name. It's got a mortgage on it.
Mhm.
Okay. And I've put it in trust. Now I've got to stay with that one lender.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to mortgage away. It's the same with equity release. A lot of equity release is a fantastic product for reducing down IHT. It's the same thing. So if you do an equity release to take out some cash as a way of gifting it out of the estate, because most people's IHT liability comes from the fact that they've got value within their house that really is just sitting there, that's creating that inheritance tax liability. So equity release, as is a product for the older generation where you are asset rich and cash poor. You could take cash out of your property and gift the cash. After 7 years, once you survive the 7 years, that value would be outside of your estate, thus reducing the size of your estate.
And that's tax-free.
But at that point, and that's tax-free as well, yeah, absolutely. But at that point, so you would then, if you then wanted to put that property into trust, you could do it, but you wouldn't be able to move provider at that point. It's more difficult.
Once you put a property into trust, can you take it out of trust?
Yeah, as long as the trustees all agree. Yeah.
Because I'm just thinking about the situation where somebody does want to change their mortgage provider after a fixed term. How do they do that?
Well, that would always be a conversation piece before we do it. You've got to have that conversation. You've got to have that conversation to say, well, look, these are the implications, these are the benefits, but these are also the negatives.
Right.
You've always got to have that conversation. People have got to go into this stuff with their eyes open, for sure.
What are the questions that people fail to ask you in regards to this topic?
People don't really know what to ask. Because again, it goes back to that whole kind of thing that people just think they need a will. People don't, and that's why, I know we'll talk about the social media in a bit, but that's really why the channel grew so quickly, is because I am doing videos on different aspects of planning, but people kind of resonate with, they understand it, but they didn't realize that they could do it. And that's the thing. And it's not really until they come and speak to somebody like ourselves that, they then get that information about stuff that they potentially could do. Because the problem also as well is that, most people think, well, I need a will. Where do I go and get a will from? And you think, well, I'll go and see my solicitor. The problem with solicitors is they act on instruction. So when you walk into the solicitor's door, you've got to know what it is that you want before you walk through the door. Otherwise, you're just going to walk out with a will. And that's also an issue that we have. They're not going to get the advice piece as to actually, well, yeah, you're getting a will, but also you probably need a nil rate band trust, an IIP trust, and all the other bits and pieces in that will.
Yeah. They're not optimizing it for long-term generations. Okay. Trusts and a property portfolio, and then trusts and businesses as well. Let's touch on the property portfolio as well. So let's say you've got a person who owns their own primary residence. That's one thing. I think we've already touched on that.
Yeah.
Okay. But let's say they've got a portfolio of properties either in their own name. So let's say buy-to-lets, standard buy-to-lets, HMOs, whatever it might be. But then they've also got, or we've got a situation where a person has properties held within a company structure. How does the trusts and the tax work in that regard?
Ultimately, if you've got properties in your sole name, what we would not be looking to do is, during lifetime, we wouldn't be looking to transfer those into trust for all the reasons I've said before. Because again, if you put it into trust, you're restricted on refinancing those properties later on. The other issue you've got is capital gains, dare I say it. So if you've got a portfolio that you've had for years and years and years that's increased in value, if you then try and transfer those properties into a trust, it's classed as a disposal of asset. So when you dispose of that asset, you pay the capital gains. So you've got to remember with capital gains that capital gains is a tax of choice. You choose to pay capital gains because you choose to dispose of the assets. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't really realize is that when you pass away, your capital gains liability also dies with you.
Right.
So if I transferred the properties into trust at the point that I died, well, then there would be no capital gains. But if I transferred the properties during lifetime into trust, as it were, then yes, I'm going to pay the capital gains. But also, I'm restricted at that point to the lending, so I'm not going to be able to get much lending on it. But also, you're restricted to what you can put into trust during lifetime. So I can only put up to the 325,000 value into that trust during lifetime, because I'm still wanting to drive a benefit from it, i.e. still receive some income.
Right.
So the value is not going to be leaving the estate at all. So I can only really put 325 into it, because if I put more than 325,000 into that trust during lifetime, it triggers what they call a lifetime inheritance tax charge, which is 20%, half the death rate, on entry. So when I put 400,000 into that trust, for instance, I pay 20% on the bid above 325. And then the periodic charge as well. So it's too restrictive, really, for what you're looking to do with a buy-to-let portfolio.
This doesn't apply to your own primary residence, though, what you're talking about.
Primary residence is different because you don't pay capital gains and such like on your primary residence.
Okay.
Yeah. And the way that the PPT trust is structured, there is a discretionary element and there's a bear element. So when you have a discretionary trust, like I just said, the maximum value you can put into that discretionary trust is 325,000 without it paying the additional tax charges.
Mm-hmm.
So when we do the PPT trust, the property trust, we're only ever going to put into the discretionary pot the value of the 325, the maximum value that we can put into it. So we're not triggering a capital gains, a periodic charge or an entry charge.
Mm-hmm.
The residue value goes into a bear trust, held ultimately for the settler.
Okay.
So that way, any growth that happens within that business or that property happens within the bear trust. So we're not creating that tax charge during lifetime.
Right.
It wouldn't be great advice if we set you up in a product that then created a tax charge for you during lifetime.
Of course.
That's not what it's about.
So let's say, for example, the properties are held within a company structure. Does this still apply, or is it different?
No, different. Ideally, if you've got a buy-to-let portfolio, ideally you want it to be in a company structure, a corporate structure, because there's so much more that you can do with a corporate structure. So if the properties are owned in that corporate structure, first thing, I don't have to take all the income. So if I own them personally, if I've got 10 properties that I own, every month I get paid cash into my bank, which I'm then going to have to pay the income tax on. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I have it paid into the limited company, if the properties are within the limited company, I'm only going to pay the income. I pay the corporation tax at 25%, which is obviously less than the 40% you would be paying as a high rate taxpayer. But then I only really need to take whatever I want to take. I haven't got to take the whole lot. I can just take a dividend or a small salary or wwhatever I need to take from the business. Right. Tax efficient wise, income tax wise, it's a much, much better. But also it's that, there's things that you can do with regard to, you might have a trading business and a property portfolio. So, I could do a group structure, for instance. I could link everything together. I could put my shares in the business into a holding company. There's so much more that you can do. We can talk about family investment companies. So I can bolt on a family investment company, which is really just a change of share class. Mm. So if I've got let's say I've got a business that's worth, £1 million for argument's sake, I could transfer, I could change the way that I own my shares. So I could be given what they call freezer shares, and I could give the growth shares to, ideally we would say a trust, but I could give those growth shares to my children. So as that business continues to grow in value, the growth is happening in the other share class, not in my shares. Mm-hmm. So I can cap your inheritance tax liability at that point. Because you've got to remember, with a limited company, it's your share value that forms part of your estate for inheritance tax purposes. Mm-hmm. So if we can cap that, then we can start working away, doing lifetime planning on how to reduce that down.
But we could still put all of this into the trust, the companies, the holding company.
Yeah, so it'll be the shares that ultimately go into the trust, not the company. The company itself is the company. It's the share, the shares that would ultimately go into the holding company and such like.
And if I put the shares into trust, does that mean I lose control in any way?
No, be a trustee, you'd be a beneficiary. So we've got a whole business team that deal with this specific thing. So we do what they call an IHT stress test report, like a tax report kind of thing. Because when we've got clients that have got business assets, property portfolios and all that sort of stuff, it's important to understand, what the goal is. What are you looking to achieve with all this? What's the plan? Is it to reduce down inheritance tax? Is it asset protection? What's the overall goal? But the other important part with it as well is to understand, where are you now? What's your inheritance tax liability at the moment? What's your capital gains liability at the moment? What's the company? What does it do? What's the structure? Have you got a group structure? We take all that information, and then one of our chartered tax advisors will then actually produce you with a report that outlines to you then what those different solutions are based on where you are at the moment and where you're trying to get to. And then from that obviously is born all the solutions as to what's possible. So maybe a group structure, maybe a holding company, maybe a family investment company, all those sort of things are ultimately then outlined to you, and it's then, we then move into implementation once that's been agreed.
I've found through conversations that I've had with some people where they've just said they don't feel compelled to take action. One has, in fact, two people have said, "Oh, it's okay. I've only got this house, Sanj. It's only this house. I don't need to waste my time on getting this done." What would be your comments around that?
Again, everybody's different. We still have people that, that have got millions of pounds, but just not interested in, I'm not interested in inheritance tax saving. I'm not interested where it goes. I'm not even going to be here. So, I'm happy for it just to pass on to the kids and be done with it, which is, dare I say, I think it's a little bit selfish, to be honest, because what you're doing then is you're burdening the kids with all of that. It's really, you just need to think about it really, and think about, well, you've taken your entire life to create what you've created. It makes sense to put some kind of a plan together, even if it's just a simple plan that passes it on in a way that's not then going to be, a mess for the kids. It's.
So is it fair to say that even, let's say, a person who has a studio apartment, it's still something that they should consider doing?
It's all relevant, isn't it? It's all relevant. If I just had a small little studio apartment that was worth, I don't know, 200 grand, and that's all I had, it's still relevant to me. It's still 200 grand that I would want to make sure that was protected. But like I say, everybody's different. Some people will just say, well, I'm not bothered. It's 200 grand. It's below the inheritance tax threshold. Just get rid of it. The issue is, because the thing you've got to remember when you talk about planning, estate planning, is it's not just about you as the individual. You've got to think about, well, where are my children? What do their estates look like? Because although you might have an inheritance tax liability, the inheritance tax may well be paid when your children pass, because it'll ultimately aggregate with their estates, increase the size of their estate. So ultimately, inheritance tax at that point could be paid. So you've just got to kind of think about it really as to, is it just for me, or am I doing this for the benefit of the kids?
On the topic of children, I am thinking, is there any way of ensuring that if the children are taking any funds out of the trust, they're doing so for sensible reasons and not being reckless with it? Do people take measures?
Yeah, some people do, but most people don't. Most people are just like, I just wanted to go to the kids. I not really care what they do with it. You got to remember that when it goes as a loan, it's still a debt, classed as a debt to their estate. The important thing really is that, we need to make sure that if you're setting it up for a particular reason, for legacy like I am, is that, whatever they take, I want it to come back, I mean, if my son went to the casino and he put it on black and it came up red and he lost the lot and he didn't have the value in his estate when he passed away, well then it's gone. All he's done at that point is just disinherit the next line of beneficiaries. And that's not really why I'm setting it up. I want to make sure that there is always, legacy, as it were. See, my driver is not about inheritance tax. Inheritance tax for me is one of those things that I'm just prepared to pay. And the reason I'm prepared to pay it is that I know that in order for me to get the value out of my estate, I've got to start giving those assets away. The issue I've got with that is that I've still got goals and aspirations of things I want to do with my life at the point I get to enjoying what it is I've actually created. If I've already given those assets away to my kids purely to save on a bill that I'm not going to be paying anyway because I'm not going to be here, well, who's it benefiting? It's benefiting the kids for sure, but it's certainly not benefiting me. So we've kind of said, well, when we get to that point to enjoying what it is that we've created, I'm just going to get on and have a good time. I'm going to do all the things I've ever wanted to do. I'm not going to be restricted in anything I want to do. And if I then pass away and there is an inheritance tax liability still to be paid, well, then it will be paid. The difference is, and this is where the bigger picture comes in, is that it's only going to be paid once. I'm only prepared to pay that bill once, because then it will go into trust.
Yeah.
And that's then when it's, my kids will have the benefit of it. But my driver, like I said before, my driver in life is to create that legacy. And the legacy is all about, even when I'm not here, I'm still going to be dad.
Yeah.
So that regardless of what happens in my kids' life, whether they get divorced or bankruptcies or whatever may well happen, they will always have what I created for them as a backup. Mm-hmm. And that for me is my driver. That's what gets me up out of bed every morning, is to think, actually, I'm providing for them even when I'm not here.
Yeah.
It's so important. Whereas if I just gave it to them, it's going to be lost in the divorce or the bankruptcy or whatever. I'm not protecting them at that point.
Yeah. Sometimes I do think, I wonder if leaving too much for the children, just might take away the motivation and the drive to create for themselves. That does
Yeah.
That does play on my mind sometimes.
And that's the beauty with having a trustee, is because you can name as to what age they benefit. Like I said before, my children won't inherit anything until they're at least 25. So 25 for me, I think is a time where, you know, they'd have experienced a bit of work, they've come out of university or whatever they're doing, and they'll be at that point really where they're looking to buy houses and such like. And that's really when they probably need it at that point. But you're right, there is that danger, obviously, that it does, you know, stump the whole kind of, you know, why do I need to go out and do all this because, you know, I've got all this behind me. There is an element of that, but...
Do people ever set up conditions whereby they can only withdraw from the trust for specific reasons? They got to meet certain conditions?
Yeah. Not very often, but yeah, you do have that sometimes. But again, that's really making sure then that your trustees are fully understanding of what that is as well. You know, and you fully trust those trustees as well. And those trustees, obviously, at that point, wouldn't be the children. They'd be different people to the children. Because the children, ultimately, once you're a trustee and you're the beneficiary, it may well say on the document, well, I don't want you to inherit until you're such, and you may well go, I'm the trustee, I'm the beneficiary, I'll just take it now and do what I want. Which, for me, I don't have any issues with, to be honest. I want them to have it, I want them to benefit. But I want them to benefit in such a way that it's not lost. That's important to me. If it is lost, it's through their own stupidity, not having been taken from them through a divorce or bankruptcy or creditor claims or whatever it may well be.
If it is lost through their own stupidity, does that become a debt on their credit reference?
No, nothing at all. The loan is a non-commercial loan. It's just a loan. It's just the way that you're receiving the funds. So if I loaned you £1,000 and I wrote down on a piece of paper, I've loaned you £1,000 and we've signed it, as it were, there's your loan note, done. Mm-hmm. You know, it doesn't form part of your thing. Do what you like with it, you know.
Mike, what are the most interesting conditions that you have seen applied that you can share?
Well, just like you said about when people can inherit, you know, some people put stipulations in as to, they've got to get to a certain threshold, like we talked about before, in education and such like, before they receive anything. They've got to have a job, they've got to have this, they've got to have that, you know. But like I say, it's not very common. Most people will say, I just want to make sure that they have it, but have it in a way that where it can't be lost.
Right. Just having this conversation with you, I am thinking, goodness me, what have I not asked him? I'm sure there's more questions that people would want the answers to. Yeah, see,
the bit that we've not really touched on is the lifetime planning. So lifetime planning is about, reducing down inheritance tax, so gifting solutions. That's a lot of clients come to us these days for gifting solutions. So gifting is about, well, let's give the kids some inheritance now, as it were, see them get on the property ladder, deposits for houses, all that sort of stuff. Because it's a benefit. It's both way benefit. Because if I don't have any benefit from it for 7 years, it's outside of the values outside of my estate for inheritance tax purposes. But it also sees the kids get on the property ladder and do what they need to do. So when we talk to clients about gifting, there's two ways that you can gift. One is just an outright gift. I could today, if I wanted to, gift £1 million to my son. Not that I'd want to do that, but I could, in essence, gift him £1 million. The issue I've got with that is, A, it's going to take 7 years for it to leave my estate. I can have no benefit from that money for the next 7 years. But also the value now sits within my son's estate from day one. So, it's his. I've lost control of it. So that's one way that you can gift. The other way you can gift is what we call via a gift trust. So we do a lot of these, a heck of a lot of gift trusts. And a gift trust is really just a trust that we're setting up during lifetime, a discretionary trust. And the maximum you can put into that discretionary trust every 7 years is $325,000, the lifetime allowance. So as a husband and wife, we could do one each. So I could do 325 in mine, my wife could do 325 in hers. So I could do 650,000 out of my estate every 7 years, as long as I have no benefit. But as a trustee, because I can be a trustee of that trust, I can still manage the money. I can still control the money.
So on that note, that limit, that threshold that you mentioned, is that for each of the parents or is that per child?
So that's per parent. So you have a lifetime allowance of 325. I have a lifetime allowance of 325. It's our tax-free allowance, the lifetime allowance. But you can use that tax-free allowance during your lifetime. But as long as you have no benefit from the gift that you made up to that allowance, after 7 years, that value is gone.
Explain this 7-year thing to me, actually.
Well, the 7-year rule is the rule that the government introduced many, many years ago now. it's a way that, because what you can't do is you can't just transfer money to somebody and it be gone out of your estate. They believe that that's wrong. So what they have is they have this 7-year rule which tapers. So it tapers away over the 7 years. So it stays at 40% because inheritance tax is 40%. So it stays at 40% for the first 3 years, and then it reduces by 8% thereafter. So if I gifted you 325,000 today, and I died in year 4, let's say, then there would be an element that would be outside of my estate, and there'd be an element that would still be in my estate. So if I died and I went through the probate, I would need to declare the value of what I gifted, but the taper would mean that actually there's a proportion still that would be still within the estate because the full thing never left. And that's really all the 7-year rule is. It's a way of the government ultimately ensuring that if you gave money away and then you died, that the value would still be in the estate within that 7-year period for inheritance tax purposes.
So on the note of gifting, you obviously described the gifting via the discretionary trust. Now, let's say, for example, somebody has gifted their child, okay, but just in the normal, regular way, not via the discretionary trust. Mm-hmm. That child then goes on and buys property with his or her wife, using that capital. And in another 10 years' time, that relationship doesn't quite work out. Then I would imagine the ramifications of that is they're splitting what you've left them.
Yeah. If I loaned my son 50 grand so he had a deposit to buy a house with his girlfriend and they decided to split up in 5 years' time, as it were, the chances of me getting my 50 grand back is pretty slim. Whereas if I did a gift trust and I put the 50 grand into the gift trust and I loaned him that 50 grand and the gift trust then also took a restriction on title on the property, well, when that property is sold, my 50 grand would come back to the trust. And my son could then come back and borrow the same 50 grand and go and buy another house with his new girlfriend. And so on. But all the time I have no benefits, after that 7-year period, that value is outside of my estate. So my son's benefited from it. I've benefited from it because it's reduced down my estate by that 50,000, as it were. My son's benefited from it, but I haven't put the value of that 50,000 into my son's estate either. I protected that 50 grand for him to use to do what he needs to do.
Mike, you speak at a lot of events about this topic. How many people, like in your endeavors, when you speak to people in your journey, how many people do you find as a percentage, just give me an idea, just do not know about this kind of stuff? Just give me an idea.
I would probably say a good 80% don't really understand the whole kind of structures that you can have.
I find that to be quite conducive with the conversations that we have with our members and community as well.
You'd be surprised the amount of people that haven't even got a will. Like I said before, 70% of the UK population haven't even got a will. We speak to millionaires and and all the rest of it on a daily basis that have not got any planning at all. Nothing. And they've got businesses, they've got overseas investments, they've got this, they've got that, massive houses, portfolios, no will. And you just think, well, that is just absolutely bonkers. It's mind-boggling to think, But for me, I think, people come to me and they say, well, I'm financially savvy. And I think, well, if you haven't got a will, you're not financially savvy.
I agree.
You haven't got a clue what's going on here. If anything, it's just ignorance, dare I say it.
It is. I mean, for me, I think you're reckless. I think it's reckless and irresponsible.
Yeah, it is. Because people, but also, most of the time they haven't got a will is because they don't understand it. They just think it was something we do later. But the trouble is you just can't say that. My father passed away with a brain tumour, and that was 8 months from start to finish. He was perfectly fine, never had a day off work, and he was perfectly fine until the point that he wasn't. And that was it. But if he hadn't had the planning in place, it would have been a nightmare.
And we're not talking just a standard will, we're talking like the proper wills that we've discussed.
Yeah, but even just having a basic will is better than not having a will at all. Because if you die without a will here in the UK, you die what they call intestate, which means you get the government will. And the intestacy, dying intestate is just a set of rules. The government set a set of rules called the Intestacy rules that determine who actually benefits from your estate. And your chances are that those people probably aren't the people that you'd want to benefit in the first place. But it will always, it'll be the wife and your children and such like, but it's your wife will receive the first £322,000 worth of your estate. If you've got a sizable estate, your wife's not going to thank you for that because she's going to receive £322,000 and she's going to receive half of any residue. The other half, if you've got children, will immediately go to those children. That can create some problems. But you can imagine how much tax the government are going to take if you die without a will. They're all over it.
I think that's pure evil. I think that is. it disturbs me how much they take that death tax.
40%, yeah. It's the worst tax. It is the worst tax. It really is. It really, really is. And to be fair, the limits that they give you, the 325, really in this day and age, doesn't really cut the mustard, really, to be honest.
How long has it been 325 for?
Oh gosh, it's been now that for a good few years now. And I think it's frozen now as well until 2030, I think it is. So it's not going to be going up anytime soon either. But about 8 years ago, they introduced the residence nil rate band. So I don't know if you know about the residence nil rate band, but the residence nil rate band is an additional tax-free allowance that happens on death. So if I own a main residence and I've got lineal descendants, so children, and my total estate value is below £2 million, then I qualify for an additional £175,000 worth of tax-free allowance on top of my 325. So I've got £500,000 worth of allowance now before my estate would pay any inheritance tax. So they introduced the residence nil rate band. They phased it in, but it's now at its top level of 175,000. But they brought that in because they felt that people were being drawn into paying inheritance tax really purely based on the value of their houses, and their houses being of a value that was, like I say, was drawing them into paying inheritance tax. So they weren't really wealthy people that should be paying inheritance tax. They were just drawn into it based on where they lived. So they introduced this residence nil rate band, as it were. So they obviously, they give it to you, but they obviously make the rules with regard to who can benefit. So like I say, if you've got assets over that 2 million, what happens is it tapers away at £1 for every £2 that you're over the 2 million mark. Mm-hmm. So at 2.35 million, it'll be gone for good. Yeah. So you'll be back to your 650. So if you've got wealthy clients that have got, 4, 5, 6, 7 million pounds worth of estate, they don't qualify for the residence nil rate band at all. And they'll only have their 650,000, 325,000 each before they pay inheritance tax. So it's important that you do a little bit of lifetime planning.
With that residence nil rate band, does that only apply to the beneficiaries in terms of the people living in the property? When you say residence,
so it's your allowance for you. So if I die today, I own a property, I've got children. If the total estate value is below 2 million, then when I go through the probate process, my executors can claim for that residence nil rate band.
Right.
That the residence nil rate band is individual. A lot of people make this mistake as well. See, I don't know if you know that when you die, as a married couple, the inheritance tax is paid on the second death.
Yes.
So if I died now today, there would be no inheritance, regardless of the value, because of the transfers to the wife, as it were. So what most people tend to do is that they'll transfer the 325 to the spouse, the survivor. So it's the inheritance tax and all the rest of it is done on the second death. They can do the same with the residence nil rate band. But the issue with that is that if I transferred my 175 to my wife and she lived for another 10, 15, 20 years, as it were, and the value then of the total estate value went above the 2 million, we'd lose both elements. She'd lose my 175 and she'd lose her own 175 because the value at the point that she passed, when the inheritance tax is payable, would be above the 2 million. So what we're saying is when I die, when an individual person dies, you should always do probate at that point. A lot of people will just say, well, it all just passes to the wife, so we don't need to do probate at this point. We'll do probate when she passes away to determine the inheritance tax. We're saying you should always do probate on first death. Because if we do the probate on first death, I can claim for the residence nil rate band. Mm-hmm. Because also with the residence nil rate band, I don't know if it's still going to be around when my wife passes away.
Yeah.
So if it's an available allowance that I can use now today,
yes,
well, then it makes sense to claim it. So let's claim it now and let's transfer the 325, the lifetime allowance, to my wife so she can use that when she passes away.
How should people be treating things like life insurance and relative life cover in relation to trusts and stuff? What would you say?
Well, any life insurances you've got should always be paying it into trust.
Yeah.
Always.
Yes.
And if you've got a broker who set you up life insurance policies that has not put it into trust, that's not good.
Yeah.
And the issue with that really is that if you die and a life insurance, let's say a £500,000 life insurance policy pays out and it's not paid into trust, it will pay directly into the estate.
Yes.
And if that's the difference between you paying inheritance tax or not, you're now going to pay tax on something that should have been tax-free.
Yes.
So the idea really is that the life insurance always pays into trust and then you're naming the beneficiaries and the trustees in the normal way. They just take the money from the trust and they do whatever they need to do with it. But the value then doesn't enter into the estate. That's so important. So important. And the same with relevant life as well. It's exactly the same. But I think relevant life has to be set up into trust anyway.
Yeah.
Same with whole in life insurance. But life insurance is a great way of mitigating IHT as well. It's an overlooked product. If you've got an inheritance tax liability of 200,000-300,000, well, there's nothing stopping you from setting up a whole of life insurance policy that would pay out at the point that you pass sufficient to pay off the IHT liability.
Yes.
Because the problem with inheritance tax is that most people only ever see the tax bill. That's all they see. They don't see the bigger picture. See, for me with mine, I think, well, actually, yes, I see that there's a bill, which is a bill that's potentially increasing, but it's all the other bits and pieces you don't see. So like for me with my death planning, I'm prepared to pay the inheritance tax, but I only want to pay it once. That's one part of the bigger picture, paying the tax once.
Yes.
The other part is that, when those assets pass over, they'll continue to increase in value. So what I've paid in inheritance tax, chances are it's going to be made back over a number of years anyway. So you've got to kind of look at everything as opposed to just seeing a tax bill, because the problem is most people see the tax bill, panic, and start gifting assets straight out of the estate. I met a guy yesterday who already transferred 2 of his buy-to-let properties to his kids and paid the capital gains on it. Why? Capital gains liability is going to die with you. You just paid a tax there for no reason. That's the problem. People just scattergun, just get this stuff out of the estate, thinking they're saving the inheritance tax. But the problem is you're not mitigating the inheritance tax at that point. All you're doing is kicking the can down the road.
On that note, with that guy who done what you just described, do you find that people often come to see you a bit too late?
Yes. Yes. Especially on the business side of things. They've already created the wealth. And then it's like, well, because once you've created the wealth, it's very difficult then to start mitigating that wealth because you've already created it. So things like company structures and family investment companies are always better to structure that at the start. But most people don't. They tend to get the idea of going to run a business and they get into running their business, and before they know it, it's a sizable business and we've not done any planning in the background.
Our members are made up of business owners.
Mm-hmm.
What would be your advice to them?
Well, the advice to them would be obviously to look at the structure. That's important. But also I'd be saying, you need to be getting a tax report done. We need to be doing a tax report for you to understand where your business is, where how you own those assets, how can we mitigate some of this stuff? What are some of the solutions that are available to you? What's your goal with the business? Is it to sell the business later on? Because if it's to sell it, then really you want to have a holding company. Because if you have a holding company and you sell it, well, then the value goes up to the holding company completely tax-free.
Yeah.
And then you're free then to take from the holding company whatever you want to take. If you haven't got that structure, that money is just going to be paid to you direct. There's issues with that.
Absolutely. I mean, I've learned so much in the couple of years that we've been speaking, and you've set up things for my family, and for which I'm really grateful. But it's been like, just hearing your story was like, oh my God, that is a really messed up situation.
Yeah. Well, the story is powerful because everybody resonates with it. And that's the thing. Most people know somebody who's been disinherited. And like I said before, 42% of all marriages are going to end in divorce. There's a lot of blended families out there now, and that's the issue. If you're a blended family and you've just got simple basic wills, there is a chance that one set of children potentially could be disinherited. And that's, it doesn't have to be that way. And that's the thing. It doesn't have to be that way. Everybody can benefit. Everyone can, you can protect those assets for the people that you ultimately want to benefit. But you can't do that with a basic will. The basic will is ultimately going to pass those assets to that named beneficiary, that next one.
Yeah.
It's then down to them to decide what they want to do with those assets, because it'll end up going through their planning, if they've even got any.
On the note of divorce, I think you've mentioned that couples should buy as tenants in common.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say, for example, the primary residence is owned by one of the spouses.
Mm-hmm.
How can they still structure that in such a way whereby they're still protecting the interests of those that they leave behind?
Well, again, it really depends on the relationship and such like as well. But again, we would always be saying, well, actually, let's add the person on. Because the other thing you've got to think about at the moment is if the one person owns the house solely, which is the main residence, and the partner doesn't, you're also losing £175,000 worth of tax-free allowance potentially.
Right.
Because they don't own a residence.
Right.
So it would make sense to add them on. But again, when we talk about doing severance of tenancy, you could do a severance of tenancy 90-10. It hasn't always got to be 50-50. It can be any percentage you want it to be. So we do a lot of that, for instance, where you've got a buy-to-let. Let's say you've got a buy-to-let. Let's say I was a high-rate taxpayer and you were a low-rate taxpayer. If we own that property jointly together, the income should be split 50% to you and 50% to me. The issue I've got with that is that I'm going to pay a high-rate tax on that 50% that I'm receiving. So what we could do in this respect is we could do a severance of tenancy, but an unequal split severance of tenancy. And we could do a declaration of trust, which ultimately states that you own 90% of the property and I own 10% of the property. And now we can fill in a Form 17 with HMRC and say, well, actually, all the income is going to be going to you as the low-rate taxpayer. And I don't receive any of the income. But as a married couple, we all benefit in it. But I'm not paying the tax at a higher rate on that income. We do a lot of that with people that have got, multiple buy-to-lets.
But let's say, for example, because I know many people that this applies to, particularly from the Indian community from which I come from, whereby, let's say it's the husband who owns the house. And I say it's common because quite often they'll own a house before they even get married. Okay. And in that kind of situation whereby the property is in the husband's name, what's the ramifications of that? And can they do anything retrospectively to tidy up any of those consequences?
Well, I mean, in that situation, what would happen is if you pass, that house ultimately would go into your trust at that point. It's then really down to who you're naming then as the trustees to manage it, but also who's the next line beneficiary. Right. So I'm guessing you're going to name your wife as the next line beneficiary. She would just benefit from the property, but the property would ultimately be owned by the trust.
Right.
At that point. So all you're really doing is you're missing out on that additional allowance, aren't you? It ultimately ends up going down your line as opposed to it being split and going down each line. Right. You see what I mean?
Okay, fantastic. What I am curious about is we have monthly meetings within Ignite Academy with different cohorts, which are limited to 12 people per cohort. And I think it would be of great value to maybe have you as a guest speaker speaking on this topic to some of our various groups.
Yeah.
Is that something you'd be open to?
Absolutely, yeah. We do a lot of that. So
super. And then the next question is, I think there's going to be a lot of people who have heard this conversation that I'm going to be interested in engaging with you and consulting with you. And I wondered if you would be open to the idea of, let's say, for example, if I got one of my team to put up a page on our website where they could fill out some basic details and then maybe book an appointment to speak to you. Is that something you'd be
100% open to? Absolutely. Yeah. Well, like I said, we've got a QR code as well that we can put on there so they can go into our system. That system then will take some details from them, assets, liabilities, that sort of stuff as well, that you'll even produce them a recommendation report if that's what they want. Okay. And again, if they want to speak to an advisor, that's completely free of charge. But like I say, we've got a team of 13, so there's advisors on hand to speak to any of them.
Yeah. That's great. So in that case, what we'll do is we'll create a page, let's just say igniteacademy.com/asset protection. I'll get them to fill out some basic info. We'll direct that to you and then you can speak to them, because I think everyone needs to pay attention to this.
Yeah, it's a massive topic. It really is, and it's so, like I say, still 70% of the UK population haven't even got a will.
This is it.
So it's a massive market, and all I've tried to do with the social media is education. I've had so many people that have come to me about trying to monetize the channels and such like, but it's never been about that. It's always just been about giving value, as it were, and getting the message out there about what's potentially possible. Because it's so important, especially in the day and age that we live these days, to protect what you're actually creating.
Are there any conversations that are applicable to wills and trusts in relation to people who are leaving the UK? Because there's a lot of people leaving the UK and going to places like Dubai.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are. There's a lot of people going to Dubai and other places, as it were. The thing you've got to remember with the UK, okay, is that if you're a UK resident, okay, you'll pay inheritance tax on your worldwide assets, as a UK resident for 10 years. So you've got to be gone for 10 years or more before you don't no longer pay tax on all of your worldwide assets. And it's corporation tax, capital gains is 5 years. So there's implications. It's not just a question of, a lot of people on TikTok and other social platforms is, I've had enough, I'm leaving. Yeah. And they're thinking that they're just leaving and they're done.
Yeah.
It's just not as simple as that. It really isn't. There's like I said, there's the 10-year tail and there's the 5-year tail that keeps you here in the UK. But also if you go and you come back and you spend more than 90 days back in the UK, well, then you're deemed back in again, because obviously the rules changed back in April last year. I think it was April last year. It's now based on a residency test as opposed to domiciled now. So there's a lot of, work that needs to be done if you're looking to leave. You need to take some advice for sure if you're looking to leave, but also if you're looking to come into the UK, there's things that can be done. For instance, if I lived in Hong Kong, for instance, and I wasn't a UK resident and I built up a wealthy portfolio of, stocks and shares or whatever it is, then we want to be making sure that there's planning in place to make sure that that value doesn't come into the UK, jurisdiction, as it were. Mm-hmm. So you're not then paying inheritance tax potentially on that. So there's things that you can do. There's trusts that you can set up, excluded property trust, for instance, to have those assets staying outside of the UK, even though you've come into the UK. Mm. So there's things to be done, but it's about taking advice. That's for sure. Not just leaving or coming, because you're opening up a whole can of worms at that point.
So Mike, just on the topic of Dubai, like you've said that they've got to be out of the country for 10 years.
10 years for them not to pay inheritance tax on their worldwide assets. So if you've got assets here in the UK that's over the inheritance tax threshold, it makes no difference if you've been gone for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you will still pay UK inheritance tax on those assets that you've got here in the UK.
And then after 10 years, they don't have to pay anything.
No, they will. If the assets are here in the UK, then they'll always pay inheritance tax here in the UK on those assets if the value is above the threshold, regardless of where they've gone in the world and how long they've gone for. What we're saying is if you leave and you're no longer a UK resident, tax resident, and you've been gone for over 10 years, then you won't pay inheritance tax on your worldwide assets, mm-hmm. but you will always still pay inheritance tax on the assets that you have here in the UK.
Typically companies or properties.
Portfolio here in the UK, as it were, but you've been gone for 20 years, and you're not a tax resident here anymore, you would still pay inheritance tax here in the UK.
Right.
And income tax if you're gaining an income from here as well.
Understood. I think loads of people are going to be interested in your services, and they should all be getting their affairs in order.
Everyone should be getting their affairs in order. Like I say, if you're 18, you should have a will.
Really?
If you're 80, you should have a will. And everyone in between should have a will.
Great. Well, Mike, thanks for coming down. Really appreciate you, mate.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me. Thanks for watching this episode. If you'd like to like, share and comment, obviously always welcome.